A young tourist, full of excitement and brimming with confidence, stepped onto the grounds of a magnificent royal palace, his eyes wide with awe. He had always dreamt of visiting such a place, a symbol of history, power, and grandeur. As he admired the towering walls and intricate architecture, he began to feel a bit more certain of himself. His friends, who had been traveling with him, noticed his growing pride and couldn't help but chuckle at how his confidence seemed to be growing by the minute. They were walking through a well-maintained courtyard, surrounded by lush gardens and the scent of blooming flowers, when the tourist, trying to keep up his bravado, looked toward the royal guards standing at attention near the entrance. The guards were dressed in full ceremonial armor, with tall, imposing hats and polished boots, their faces stoic and unwavering as they stood at their posts. They were the perfect image of discipline and strength, but the tourist wasn't impressed. "Well, I'm pretty sure I could take one of those guards," he said, laughing lightly, not realizing the gravity of what he had just said. "I mean, look at them. They seem so serious, but I bet I could outmatch them in strength." His friends paused in their tracks, glancing at each other in surprise. They didn't think he was serious, but the tourist, not noticing their reactions, continued his boast. "I could easily challenge one of them to a test of strength. I mean, they're just standing there all day doing nothing. They look strong, but I'm sure they're not as tough as they seem." He flexed his arms, showing off his muscles to his friends, who started to chuckle nervously, unsure whether he was just joking or genuinely trying to impress them. His friends tried to reason with him, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't such a good idea. They pointed out that the royal guards were trained professionals, experts in combat and discipline, far beyond anything they could handle. But the tourist wasn't listening. His pride had taken over, and he was determined to prove himself. The idea of challenging the royal guard seemed thrilling to him, something that would make the day memorable and exciting. He had no idea just how wrong he was about to be. With a confident grin, he turned toward the nearest royal guard, ignoring the concerned glances of his friends. "Hey," he called out, "what do you say? Want to have a little test of strength? I'm sure I can show you a thing or two." The royal guard didn't react. He didn't even look in the tourist's direction, his expression unchanged. The tourist's friends looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Was this really happening? But the tourist wasn't deterred. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, convinced that the challenge would be easy. "Come on, I know you're strong, but how strong can you really be?" he said louder this time, trying to draw attention from the nearby bystanders. The crowd that had started to gather looked on in curiosity, sensing the tension in the air. No one knew what would happen next, but it was clear that this tourist was about to do something bold, and maybe foolish. His friends were growing nervous, trying to tell him to back down, but it was too late. The challenge had been thrown down, and now there was no turning back. The royal guard, unmoved by the tourist's taunts, remained silent, standing tall and composed. The crowd waited, unsure whether to laugh, cheer, or intervene. What would happen next? Would the tourist truly follow through with his challenge, or would he realize the gravity of the situation before it was too late? The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, and in that moment, it was anyone's guess what would unfold. The tourist stood there, looking at the royal guard, convinced that his challenge would be taken lightly. But the guard didn't react at all. He remained completely still, his expression as unchanging as the stone statues surrounding the courtyard. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The crowd that had gathered nearby whispered to each other, unsure of what was about to happen. The tourist, however, didn't let the silence discourage him. He only grew more confident, believing that this was exactly what he needed to prove his strength. His friends, still unsure, exchanged nervous glances. They had tried to warn him, but now it was clear that he wasn't going to back down. They didn't know what to expect, but they all hoped that the situation wouldn't escalate further. The tourist, oblivious to their concerns, stepped forward boldly. With a deep breath, he spoke again, this time louder and with even more conviction. "I'm serious," he called out to the royal guard. "You're probably thinking this is just a joke, but I can show you that I'm stronger than I look." The crowd looked at each other, some unsure whether to laugh or gasp in surprise at the tourist's determination. His friends began to look uncomfortable, whispering to him to stop before things went too far. But the tourist ignored them. His pride had taken control, and he wasn't going to let it go. He had come so far, and now, in front of everyone, he had to prove that he wasn't just a boastful tourist. He was someone who could live up to his words. As the silence stretched on, he turned to the crowd, hoping to rally their support. "Come on, everyone, who thinks I can take on this guard?" he asked, raising his hands in mock challenge, hoping for some encouragement from the bystanders. To his surprise, a few people cheered him on, caught up in the excitement of the moment. But the royal guard remained utterly still, his eyes fixed ahead, paying no attention to the growing tension around him. The more the tourist tried to provoke the guard, the more the crowd began to feel uneasy. It was becoming clear that the guard was either completely uninterested or, even more likely, completely unaffected by the tourist's words. At this point, the challenge had turned into a spectacle, and the tourist could feel the weight of the situation. It was no longer about strength. It was about proving something to the crowd, and more importantly, proving something to himself. He cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, preparing himself for whatever might come next. He couldn't back down now. "I'll make it even more interesting," the tourist continued, trying to up the stakes. "If I win, I want a special token from the palace, something to show that I proved my strength to a royal guard." His voice was louder now, demanding attention. He looked around, hoping for more support, but the crowd grew quieter. Even the few who had cheered him on before were now hesitant, watching closely, sensing that the situation was starting to slip beyond the tourist's control. But still, the royal guard remained unfazed, his face as stoic as ever. There was no change in his posture, no flicker of emotion in his eyes. It was as if he had heard this kind of challenge 1,000 times before and was simply waiting for it to run its course. The tourist took a deep breath and steeled himself, preparing to make his move. The crowd waited, their eyes fixed on him, wondering what would happen next. Would he back down? Would the guard finally respond? Or was something even more unexpected about to unfold? The silence that hung in the air was almost unbearable. The tourist stood there, watching the royal guard, expecting some kind of reaction. He had assumed that the guard would laugh it off, or maybe step forward and engage in some friendly banter. But instead, the guard stood completely still, his eyes focused ahead as if nothing in the world mattered except his duty. The tourist's earlier bravado began to feel a bit out of place, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. His friends, who had been watching nervously from the sidelines, were now whispering amongst themselves. They could see that the situation wasn't turning out as the tourist had expected. They had tried to warn him, tried to tell him that challenging a royal guard wasn't something to take lightly, but now it was clear that there was no turning back. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd, which had initially been excited, was now beginning to feel uncomfortable. The tourist cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. He had to save face. He couldn't back down now, not in front of so many people. With a deep breath, he called out again to the royal guard, this time his voice louder, more forceful. "Come on, what's the matter? Don't you think I can handle this?" he challenged, stepping forward a little closer. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he wasn't about to show it. The crowd, though, was on edge, sensing that this wasn't just a playful moment anymore. Something about the tourist's insistence and the royal guard's unyielding silence was making the situation feel more serious. But still, the guard didn't move, not a single step. His eyes remained locked forward, his posture straight and unyielding. It was as if he was completely unaffected by the tourist's words. The tourist, growing more desperate to prove himself, made another move. He tried to get even closer, trying to stand right in front of the guard, but the guard didn't budge an inch. It was a clear message. This wasn't a game. The tourist's friends were growing more anxious now. They had seen enough. They started calling out to him, urging him to stop. "This isn't a joke. Stop it," one of them shouted, but the tourist was too caught up in the moment. He couldn't back down now. The challenge had been thrown, and he had to prove that he wasn't just another tourist with empty words. He had to show that he had the strength, the courage to stand up to the guard, even if it meant pushing things further. "Fine, if you're not going to move, I'll make you," he muttered under his breath, preparing for what was about to come. He wasn't sure what he was thinking, but his pride wouldn't let him back out. This had become more than just a challenge to the royal guard. It had become a test of his own strength, his own sense of pride. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and some even began to shake their heads, wondering how far this tourist was willing to go. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and no one could predict what the royal guard would do. Would he respond? Would he let this foolish challenge go unnoticed? Or was something more dramatic about to take place? The uncertainty in the air was palpable, and all eyes were on the tourist, waiting for his next move. The tourist's heart raced as he stood facing the royal guard, fully convinced that he was about to prove something not just to the guard, but to everyone watching. His earlier words seemed to echo in his ears. "I can take him down." With every second that passed, the challenge seemed more like an unspoken battle of wills. The crowd, though hushed, was still watching closely, waiting to see how this would play out. The tourist, now feeling the weight of his own challenge, wasn't about to let this moment slip away. He stepped forward, shifting his stance and trying to gather all the strength he could muster. He stretched his arms out, rolled his shoulders, and took a deep breath. The crowd could feel the tension building as the moment dragged on. This wasn't just about physical strength anymore. It was about pride, about winning something intangible. The tourist was no longer just a curious traveler. He was a man bent on proving something to himself and to everyone around him. With a quick motion, the tourist lunged toward the guard. His intentions were clear. He was going to try and overpower him. He pushed forward with all his might, trying to use his body weight to force the guard back. But to his utter surprise, the royal guard didn't move, not even a step. The tourist's momentum, powered by his excitement, only caused him to stumble slightly as he made contact with the guard's immovable form. The guard stood there, unflinching, as if the tourist's entire attempt was nothing more than a gentle breeze brushing past him. The crowd held its breath, unsure whether to gasp or chuckle. The tourist, on the other hand, felt a rush of embarrassment flooding over him. This wasn't how he had imagined it. He had expected some sort of response, perhaps the guard stepping back in shock, or maybe even a show of strength in return. But no, the guard remained as firm as a mountain. Confusion swept over the tourist's face. His hands were still placed against the guard's chest, but it was clear that all his force was useless. It was as if he was pushing against a wall of stone. For a moment, he just stood there, completely still, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time since the challenge began, doubt began to creep into his mind. The royal guard's face remained neutral. There was no anger, no frustration. Just calm, controlled composure. He didn't even flinch at the tourist's clumsy attempt to push him. The longer the guard stood there without a word, the more the tourist's own sense of pride began to deflate. The realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't just fighting a person. He was facing a professional. The crowd, now starting to sense the growing tension, looked between the tourist and the royal guard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Would the guard finally respond? Would the tourist back down in shame? The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as everyone stood frozen, watching the standoff unfold. The tourist, feeling the mix of confusion and frustration, took a step back, his hand still slightly trembling. The reality of the situation was sinking in, but he refused to admit defeat so easily. His pride, still holding him firm, pushed him to try again. But as he glanced at the royal guard, something in the guard's eyes told him there was more to this than just physical strength. It was about control, discipline, and the quiet confidence that came from years of training. And in that moment, the tourist understood. This wasn't about power. It was about respect. But would he back down, or would he find the humility to accept the truth before it was too late? The crowd, equally mesmerized and uncertain, waited for the next step in this curious challenge. The tourist stood there, feeling a mix of embarrassment and confusion. His previous boldness had now been replaced with doubt as he realized just how much he had underestimated the situation. He had assumed that his physical strength, combined with his confidence, would easily win him this challenge. But the royal guard stood unmoving, silent, and strong, an immovable object that not even his best efforts could budge. The crowd around them remained still, sensing the shift in the air. The excitement from before had turned into something quieter, more tense. The tourist tried to gather himself, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He had come this far, and he wasn't ready to admit defeat. But something in the guard's calm, unwavering posture told him that this wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. It was no longer about proving his strength. Now it was about understanding something much deeper. The strength of the royal guard, not just in body, but in mind, in control, and in dignity. After a few moments of silence, the tourist took a step back, his eyes flickering to the crowd. The onlookers were still watching, but now there was no laughter, no cheers, just quiet anticipation. They had expected some kind of spectacle, but what they had witnessed instead was a lesson in humility, a lesson that the tourist was beginning to grasp. His chest rose and fell with each breath, but there was no more bravado, no more posturing. He had been humbled by the quiet strength of the royal guard. The guard, without moving a muscle, shifted slightly, as if to indicate that the challenge had come to an end. At least for now. His composure was still perfect, his eyes steady and calm. It was almost as if he had anticipated the tourist's efforts, knowing that the challenge would eventually run its course. But instead of responding with force or anger, he remained completely still, his silence speaking volumes. The crowd, now fully aware of the shift, started to murmur in disbelief. They had expected the guard to retaliate in some dramatic fashion, but instead they had witnessed a calm, composed individual who had done nothing more than stand his ground. The tourist, slowly coming to terms with the reality of the situation, felt the weight of his earlier words pressing down on him. He had foolishly believed that strength was all about force, that it was about pushing harder and faster, showing others what he was capable of. But standing before the royal guard, he now understood that true strength wasn't just about how much power you could exert. It was about control, patience, and the ability to stand firm in the face of anything. The guard had never needed to move. He had already won the challenge, not with physical strength, but with his unwavering resolve. The tourist swallowed hard, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and realization. He had been wrong. Not just about the challenge, but about his own assumptions about strength and what it meant to truly win. It wasn't about dominating or overpowering someone else. It was about recognizing when you needed to stop, when you needed to let go of your pride and admit that you had underestimated the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tourist gave a small, reluctant nod. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of respect. He hadn't won the challenge, but in that moment, he had learned something far more valuable than any token or prize. The royal guard hadn't said a word, but in his stillness, he had conveyed a message that the tourist would never forget. And as the crowd began to slowly disperse, there was a sense of quiet admiration for both the tourist, who had learned his lesson, and the royal guard, whose calm strength had left everyone speechless. The tourist stood in silence, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. A few moments ago, he had been full of confidence, certain that he could impress the crowd and prove his strength against the royal guard. But now, all of that seemed so far away. The earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a deep sense of humility. The guard had done nothing to retaliate or even acknowledge his challenge, but the message was clear. The tourist had underestimated the true meaning of strength, and he now understood that it wasn't about physical force, it was about control and presence. The guard had stood unmoving throughout the entire challenge, calm and collected, never showing even a flicker of emotion. His silence spoke louder than any words could have, and it left the tourist with a lesson that was much deeper than he had expected. The tourist glanced around, his gaze shifting to the onlookers. They were all still watching, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet admiration. Some had been chuckling at first, but now they were silent too, their attention fully focused on the royal guard and the tourist. He felt his face redden as he realized how foolish he must have looked. It wasn't just that he had failed to impress the guard. It was that he had failed to understand the nature of the challenge he had initiated. He had assumed that it would be a simple test of physical strength, but instead it had become a test of his own character, his own ability to learn and adapt. He had learned that true strength wasn't about overpowering someone else. It was about knowing when to fight and when to stand still, when to use force, and when to simply remain in control. The tourist took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. His friends, who had been so nervous just moments ago, now looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. They hadn't wanted him to make a fool of himself, but they knew there was little they could do once he had made up his mind. As the tourist turned back to the royal guard, he couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the calm composure the guard had displayed. He had not been aggressive, nor had he been dismissive. He had simply stood his ground, showing that he was more than capable of handling any challenge with grace. The crowd, sensing the shift in the air, began to move away, murmuring amongst themselves about the unusual but enlightening encounter they had just witnessed. The tourist was left standing in the middle of the courtyard, his mind replaying everything that had just happened. He had come here thinking that strength was all about who could push harder, who could be the most physically powerful. But now he realized that true strength came from within, from having the wisdom to know when to act and when to hold back. He took another step back, this time with purpose. The guard, still unmoving, never looked at him directly, but the tourist could feel the weight of his presence. Without a word, he bowed his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson he had learned. It wasn't much, but it was his way of showing respect. The royal guard had not needed to speak to make his point clear, and the tourist, in that moment, knew that the guard had already won. As he turned away, his friends walked up to him, offering small smiles of encouragement, but they didn't need to say anything. The lesson had been learned. The tourist had come to realize that strength wasn't always about dominating or proving yourself in front of others. It was about knowing your own limitations and having the grace to accept them. The royal guard, without ever raising a hand, had shown him that. And for the tourist, that would be a lesson he would carry with him long after he left the palace grounds. The tourist slowly walked away from the royal guard, his thoughts swirling in his mind. His earlier pride had been replaced by a humbling sense of realization. What had started as a simple challenge, something he thought would be just another fun moment during his trip, had turned into a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. He felt the weight of his earlier boast hanging over him, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson that had come from the most unexpected source, the royal guard, whose quiet strength had shown him that power was not just about physical force. As he walked further into the courtyard, he could still hear the whispers of the crowd around him. There was no more laughter, no more joking. The atmosphere had shifted, and people were now speaking with a certain respect. Even those who had initially found the whole situation amusing now seemed to recognize that the tourist had experienced something profound. He could sense their quiet admiration, and though he still felt a little embarrassed, he couldn't help but feel proud in his own way. His friends had followed him, walking close behind, but none of them said anything. They didn't need to. It was clear that they too were reflecting on what had just happened. They had all seen it, the way the tourist had struggled to match the calm of the guard, how he had tried to force a physical challenge, but ultimately found that there was something much stronger than brute strength at play. The friends glanced at one another, but their expressions weren't judgmental. Instead, there was understanding. They had been worried when the tourist made the challenge, but now they realized that something important had been learned that day. The tourist stopped walking and looked back toward the royal guard, still standing as if nothing had happened. There was something so calm and composed about the guard's presence that it made the tourist feel small in comparison. And yet, instead of feeling defeated, he felt a deep sense of respect. The guard had shown him, without words, that true strength was about control, patience, and the ability to stay calm in any situation. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about having the wisdom to know when to act and when to let go. As the tourist stood there, looking at the guard, a realization began to settle in his chest. He had spent so much time thinking that strength was all about proving himself to others. He had wanted to show off, to boast, to win. But in the quiet composure of the royal guard, he now saw that true strength wasn't something that needed to be flaunted. It was something that was already there, unshaken by challenges, unbothered by the need to prove anything. His friends stood beside him now, and they too were watching the royal guard. The moment felt almost surreal. What had started as a bit of fun, a boastful challenge, had turned into a lesson on humility, grace, and strength. No one had needed to say a word. The lesson had been taught simply by the guard's presence and his unwavering silence. The crowd, too, had seen it, seen the truth in what had unfolded. And now there was no laughter, no mockery, only a quiet respect for what had just taken place. The tourist turned to his friends, his expression softening. He didn't need to say anything. They all understood. They had witnessed it too. A silent agreement passed between them, and they knew that today, the real victory wasn't about the challenge or the outcome. It was about the lesson that had been learned. The lesson of strength, but also of humility, and the quiet power of understanding one's place in the world. As they made their way toward the exit of the palace grounds, the tourist felt a strange sense of peace. He had come to the palace to see the sights, to enjoy his time as a traveler, but what he would remember most was not the grand architecture or the beautiful gardens. It would be this moment, the challenge he had foolishly set, and the lesson that had followed. The royal guard had left a lasting impression, and the tourist knew that from now on, he would think twice before making such bold assumptions about what true strength really was. The tourist walked away from the royal palace grounds, feeling like a different person than when he had arrived. His friends, who had been quietly following him, now walked beside him, their steps slow and thoughtful. The day had turned out so differently than they had all expected. What had begun as a lighthearted challenge, a simple display of bravado, had transformed into something much more meaningful. The lesson, one that the tourist would carry with him for a long time, wasn't one that could be taught in a classroom or read in a book. It was something he had experienced firsthand. As they continued their walk, the group moved slowly, each person lost in their own thoughts. The usual chatter that had filled their conversations earlier was absent now. There was no need for words. The tourist's mind kept drifting back to the royal guard, who had stood so still and calm throughout the entire ordeal. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the guard had not needed to say a word. His silent strength had spoken louder than anything the tourist could have done. The guard had shown him that real power was not about showing off, but about having the strength to remain calm and composed when everything around you was in turmoil. He glanced at his friends, noticing how their expressions had changed as well. They had seen the same thing he had, the way the guard had stood without moving, without speaking, and yet had conveyed such a powerful message. There was no judgment in their eyes, no teasing or making light of the situation. They understood. They had witnessed something meaningful, something that went far beyond a simple physical challenge. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies in restraint, in knowing when to hold back and when to let go. The tourist's thoughts shifted again to his earlier assumptions. Before this experience, he had believed that strength was about pushing harder, showing off, and forcing others to recognize your power. But now he saw how wrong he had been. True strength wasn't something that needed to be flaunted or displayed. It was quiet. It was unshakable. It didn't need to prove itself to anyone. And most importantly, it came with wisdom. The wisdom to know when to step forward and when to remain still. As they walked through the streets, heading toward the next destination, the tourist found that he was no longer looking at the world the same way. His earlier arrogance had given way to a deeper appreciation for the subtle forms of strength that existed around him. He had learned that strength wasn't always visible in the way someone moved or spoke. It could be found in a steady gaze, a calm demeanor, and a silent confidence that didn't require validation from anyone. It was a strength that came from within, and it was far more powerful than any outward display of force. His friends, sensing the change in him, smiled quietly to themselves. They had known the tourist long enough to see when he had truly learned something important. There were no grand speeches or dramatic moments needed. This was a quiet lesson, one that would stay with him long after they left the royal palace. They didn't need to say anything. The tourist's transformation was evident in the way he now carried himself, a little more humble, a little more aware of the world around him. As the group continued on their journey, the tourist felt lighter, not burdened by the need to prove himself. He had come to a realization that would shape the way he viewed strength and power from that day forward. And in the end, the royal guard had done more than just teach him a lesson. He had given him something far more valuable, an understanding of what true strength really meant. The tourist knew that the memories of this day and the quiet wisdom of the royal guard would stay with him for a lifetime.